Hello, thanks for joining us today. I'm Thomas Burnell. I'm the Director of Sales here at Experts Exchange. We're very excited to have JumpCloud with us today for our webinar. With that, I'm going to hand it over to our presenter, Mr. Scott Reed.
Thanks so much, Thomas, and thanks everyone for joining us today. Today we're going to talk about how we can use PowerShell to automate parts of our IT day-to-day life. I'm a former sysadmin and IT supervisor and currently work as a Senior Success Engineer at JumpCloud. At JumpCloud, I interact with customers daily and also represent JumpCloud as being the Spice for Screen guy. Some things I've done at JumpCloud to make things easier for IT admins is I created the JumpCloud PowerShell module, and that's going to kind of form the foundation of what we're talking about today. This webinar is really for any IT professional who interacts with cloud applications and who's trying to automate these interactions to make their lives easier. IT professionals with a basic understanding of PowerShell or a desire to learn it are going to get a lot out of this presentation. In terms of what we're going to talk about today, this is not a JumpCloud demo. We're going to start by explaining RESTful APIs and really what's happening when we make interactions on websites or when we interact with cloud providers. We're going to go through some examples of using APIs and use MXToolBox to show us how an API works. We're going to look at some examples of how we can do an API call and convert a function into a module. We'll also look at some more advanced examples of PowerShell APIs and how we can take a challenge like adding users to a G Suite group and use PowerShell to automate this. So let's start talking about what the basics of a REST API call is. And really what we're talking about is anytime you make an action through your web browser or through an application, the way that that action is translated into a response is through an API. So you're on your computer, you on a website, you click a button, that button click is translated into an API call, and then the response is sent to a web server and returned to you as an object. So let's see an API in action. And the example that we're going to use is MXToolBox, which is a great tool that I've used in the past to check things like a global blacklist to see if someone on the sales team went rogue on a mail merge and perhaps got your domain blacklisted. So let's check this out and kind of look what's going on behind the scenes. So here's an example of MXToolBox in action. And what we're doing is we're seeing a lookup for JumpCloud. And this blacklist is saying, okay, green is good. We are not on a blacklist. MXToolBox offers a REST API, and they actually offer a lookup tool that does a great job at explaining kind of what's going on behind the scenes. So here in this tool, you'll see we're going to type in the command blacklist, and this argument, which is in fact the domain that we want to look up against. And on the right here, we've got Chrome Web Tools open that are going to actually show us this request happening inside the browser. This is kind of that behind the scenes looks of what's going on a website when we take an action. So here on the right, this is what's happening behind the scenes in Chrome. And you'll see that what we have here is we have a URL where this request is being sent. And we've got something called a method, looks like it's get. And then we've got this header item that has something called authorization in it. So when we clicked on the first tab and did that lookup where we saw green is good, here's our response where we're seeing a very similar, but instead we're seeing it in the form of this object. So let's understand that request a little more. All API requests always go to a URL. So that URL defines the endpoint that we want to communicate with. In this example, we were looking at the blacklist endpoint on the lookup, and we gave it JumpCloud. The method here was a get. The URL is always going to be specific to the API. And when we think about scripting this, we're always going to have to find this inside of the documentation for that application. The method that we use are universal. So methods examples are like get to get information, post to create information, put to update information, or delete to delete information. That anatomy of this request is specific to that method, that interaction that we want. Do we want to get data? Do we want to put data somewhere? And all the time we'll use a header and that header will authorize us to make that request. The body of the request is specific to the methods that have you sending information out to that web service. A put or a post requires, what information do you want to put into the service? What information do you want to update? Here's the meat and potatoes of that request for this MXToolBox example. So as we talked about, that URL is the endpoint that we're communicating with. The method defines what data we want, and the headers say, how do we authorize to this? And in this example, we're going to use an API key to authorize. So what happens after we send our request? And the answer is we get a response. So the response for almost all API endpoints come in this JSON form. And we shouldn't be afraid of JSON. JSON is just a data type that works really well for PowerShell objects. That's why I love interacting with APIs so much in PowerShell, because of how it interprets JSON. So let's kind of see this response in action and just how different doing an API call inside of PowerShell is than what we saw using that blacklist tool inside of MXToolBox. So here we are. This is PowerShell on my Mac, and I'm running VS Code as my IDE. And what you'll see here is this is a basic lookup converted using the MXToolBox API. You'll see my URL, I've got my API key, I populate my headers, and I use this command Invoke-RestMethod to interact with their API. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to run this command on the right, and then we're going to kind of look at these results. So the results are stored inside this API results variable. And as you'll see, this is formatted a little differently than that JSON blob that comes back inside of Chrome. If we want to, we can see that blob. We can just use the built-in function, convert to JSON. And this is a cool trick that we can use to expand objects, kind of like a show object for any response that we're doing. In addition to kind of being able to see that blob of the object, we can also dial in and see what defines that response, what defines the fields being returned using getMember. And here we'll see under all these note properties, these are parts of the object that are being returned in this API call. What I'm interested in here, we're looking at a blacklist. We want to see if anyone has gone rogue and gotten our domain onto a blacklist. So I really only care about the parts of this object that show failed, warning, and passed. So that's what we're going to do now. We're going to select just these pieces of the object out. So now that we have that, that's pretty cool. All right, we can kind of see what we want. There's no failed and no warnings, which is good. But we can also use built-in PowerShell functions like format lists to see this in an easier to read form. So that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how PowerShell is so powerful to interpreting JSON and working with APIs. So in addition to the way that the objects work, as we see here on the left, this is us using PowerShell to filter this object to only look at the details we want to see, the failed, warning, and passed parts of that object. On the right here is the full JSON blob that gets returned when we're inside of something like Chrome. And you'll see here that we've got much, much more control for handling these objects. The next big piece is tool-making. So tool-making is the idea is applications offer a UI that allow you to interact with them with the intent of how the developers have given you buttons. Well, maybe you have specific use cases where those buttons aren't available. Tool-making is your opportunity to make those buttons and make those tools that make that app specific to you and your organization. So what we had, looking at how we were interacting with PowerShell before, was we had a script. That script was specific to those calls where we had hard-coded values like JumpCloud, and we were only looking at the blacklist endpoint. Scripts are great, but functions are better. And functions are better because they're reusable. The idea being that you could use that API to look up different domains, to look up different endpoints on different domains. And the way to do that is to turn that script into a reusable function. So let's start, before we look at how to build our first function, at just some fundamentals that we should kind of think about before we even start building our tool. Tools should serve a specific purpose. they should get something or set something or add something. But the whole idea is that they should serve a specific purpose so that they can be used together with other tools. And that makes reusability king. Documentation is also super important. With any of the tools I build, I spend just as much time building the tool as I do documenting it. And it's what makes PowerShell great is that documentation support is built right in. We also can use tools to make tools. And that's what we'll look at in the second half of this presentation. How we can leverage existing PowerShell tools to make our experience creating tools and sharing them with others much, much easier. So now that we've kind of got those tool-making fundamentals down, let's focus on that less is more concept and how we can apply that to that script we created. As we take a script, we turn it into a function, and then we can link those functions and group them together into a module. So here's our script. And really what we're looking at is we want to find parameters or the values that we would want to modify to make this script reusable. So if we look at this basic API call, we can see we have a URL, and it looks like in that URL, we've got the final last two pieces of it, which are blacklist and JumpCloud. We also have this concept of an API key, and API keys are specific and unique to the owners of that application. So this is likely another property that we want to make reusable, and that seems to be about it, pretty basic. So let's dive back into the MXToolBox lookup and see where these parameters come into play. So here we are inside this tool, and let's look how modifying the command modifies our API request here in this lookup application. So I just changed to jumpcloud.com to jumpcloud.net, and we can see that that modifies the end of our URL. It also looks like we've got different lookup types. So right now we've got blacklist listed, but there's a ton of different ways we can use this tool to look up things like an SPF record or an A record. And it appears modifying this value changes that part of the URL that lives in front of JumpCloud. So check this out. This is a basic function that we've changed from a script into a function that takes these parameters into play. So to explain this function, if we look it up, the name of this function is getMXLookupBasic. And it looks like we have two parameters, and these parameters are what make our URL unique. We still have our API key hard-coded, and that's really all we had to do to make this script into a function. So let's see how we can take this basic function and use it to interact with more than just JumpCloud and that blacklist endpoint. So here we are back inside of VS Code, and I'm loading this function into memory by running it. Once it's loaded into memory, to use it, I just call it. After calling it, you'll see I have parameters that I can enter. So I'm putting in the parameter for the command blacklist and the domain for JumpCloud. And boom, same thing as our script before. Now, you can see that instead of having to modify the script, I can come in here and just modify this function to make it look up something else. So here we're looking up the A record for JumpCloud. Pretty neat. If we look at what else we can do, we can change the domain we're looking up by simply changing that domain parameter to jumpcloud.net. So we've taken a script and we've made it reusable, which is the power of toolmaking. So this is a great starting point, but it's a basic function. And I named this function getMXLookupBasic because there's two different kinds of functions you can make inside of PowerShell. There's basic and advanced functions. If I 100% recommend starting out building basic functions and then converting those basic functions into advanced functions. It's something that we call an MVP, or minimum viable product. The idea that you just want to show your proof of concept, and it's always easiest to do that with a basic function. So what's wrong with this basic function, and where can we improve it? Well, for one, the command argument that we have here, that idea of like, hey, I want to find the blacklist, or hey, I want to find the A record, there's no validation that lets us know what commands are available. So that's kind of a bummer. Additionally, I made this not completely reusable. So this function hard codes my API key. That's not very cool. And if I were to release this or share this, I wouldn't want to because I'd be sharing this with friends. So Our API keys have to be things that we always keep secured, and we don't ever want to hard code those into things. So let's look at if we can convert this basic function into an advanced function. So here is get MX lookup. And what's cool about this is I've actually got this published to the PowerShell gallery. So this is something that I'll show you once we finish talking through how it works, how you can install this on your machine and actually leverage this tool to, you know, if a ticket comes in that says, hey, why aren't we getting an email? You can quickly look up to see if you're on a blacklist. So what's going on in this function? Well, people always ask, what the heck is commandlet binding? And this is something that's required to tell PowerShell that this is now an advanced function, and this function can take in more details, more things like this parameter block, where we have things like parameter validation. Parameter validation allows us to say, hey, these are the only values that can be configured for this JumpCloud command variable. So in this case, I just looked up the documentation for this API, and I've plugged in all the options that we have. So we've got MX, we've got A, we've got DNS, SPF, and one thing I also found is that these are case sensitive. So if I'm going to look up the SMTP value for a certain domain, I actually have to have a capital X. And there's a way for me to build this into PowerShell using this ignore case. So this makes this case sensitive. So parameter validation is extremely powerful, with the idea being that we're in complete control of how this tool can be used and how this tool could potentially produce errors. And by creating a validate set, I've kind of taken that under my control with this parameter. Looking down, we also have these dynamic parameters. So these are a little more advanced, but essentially what they allow us to do is, based on the input of one parameter, how can that change how we verify another parameter? And I'm not going to dive completely into how that works, but specifically what I found here is for the majority of all these commands, it wanted an FQDN, something like jumpcloud.com. But specifically for the pointer record, it wanted an IP address for the API. So that's how I built in this concept of, hey, if you use the pointer record, don't put in a domain, put in an IP address. And that's what we see here with the dynamic parameter. To look at what else we have going on with the idea of an advanced function is we have this concept of a begin, process, and end block. And those blocks are pretty self-explanatory. The begin block runs once when the function's called. This is where we can do things like set variables that we'll use time and time again if we're going to do multiple things with this function, if we're going to pass multiple objects into this function. The process block is where that idea of doing multiple things with this function occurs. All of the code inside the process block will run for each object or each call that we're doing for this function. The end block then runs once after all of those objects cycle through that function. So the idea here is to allow us to optimize the performance by, if something only needs to be done once, put it in the begin block. Create your output during your process block, but then only output it once in the end block. And that's really what this function is showing us. So get MX lookup, and you'll see this command here called connect MX online. What the heck is that? Well, that's a little function that I wrote, available, that you guys can see inside of the GitHub that I have for this, which is my playground GitHub, which is linked inside the chat. And this is the concept of using two commands together to solve a function. What does it do? It just makes sure that you set an API key to use with this function, and that once it's set, you don't have to re-enter it. Well, how do these functions play together and get packaged together? And the answer is a module. So this is the module that is published on the PowerShell gallery for this demonstration. And this module is available for download, which we'll see in a following slide. But the body of a module are really only two files. We have this concept of a module manifest, which we'll see here on the left. And this defines, what does this module do? So here you put in things like a description for the module. You also put in your functions to export. And guess what? You don't have to figure out the syntax for this. We're going to look at how we can use tools to create these files for us. This actual module file here on the right, we've got a manifest and a module file, is simply where we put our functions. And if we just group functions together and then save them in a file that ends with PSM1, that's the most basic way you can build a module that we could share with our team. So if you got some basic functions and you want to share them with a coworker, simply save those functions together in a PSM1 file and share that file with them, and they'll be able to import it using this command down here to use that file. So let's kind of see this tool in action and how we've made a tool that's not just reusable, but also allows us to control our errors with that concept of parameter validation. So here we are, and you'll see I'm inside of the folder that contains my PSD1. Running the command import module loads it. If I run the command git command and tell it which module, this module's name is MXLOOKUP, it shows us the command. So here's us using the command again in the same sort of format. Whoa, check it out, it asks for my API key. Now that I've connected with my API key, I can reuse this command without having to re-enter it. Here again, I'm changing this to JumpCloud.net, showing the reusability, and then going in, you'll see I'll change the command type. Instead of looking for the blacklist, why don't we look at the SPF record for this domain? And this tool is not just reusable by me, but reusable by anyone else and any other admins that are out here that are interested with interacting with this API from the command line. So that module building part, getting those manifest files and those module files, how do we do that? The answer is we can use tools. And what we're going to talk about now are the 3 Ps I use in my tool making. We'll start with Plaster, which builds the module scaffolding or the files that we'll need to populate, like our module manifest and our module file. Then we'll look at Tester, which is how we can test our commands before we publish and share them, so that we can not only have control of our errors, but have control of how we test to see how updating one part of the module may affect other parts of it. To install these on your machine, it's as simple as, I guess I'll say 1, 2, 3, 4. As you'll see here on the right, these are the commands that we need to run on our machines to install these tools. Platypus is then that same sort of scaffolding tool, but not for module building, for module documenting, which when we think back to kind of the things that we want to know when we think about tool making, documentation is incredibly important. The last thing we want to do after we build a tool is have to spend time explaining how it works. If we document the right way, we can not just take that out of the equation, but we can make it so that people can use our tool without any user interaction, and we can start moving on to building our next tools. So here's Plaster. Plaster is the idea that we can create the files that we need to fill in to turn those functions into a module. And really what Plaster does is it creates a folder structure that just looks just like this repo here, this playground MX lookup. Here it's going to create our PSM1, our PSD1, and also create a folder for tests where we'll look at how we can use regression testing to test our functions. Additionally, it'll create folders for us to put our documents in, where we'll put our documentation. Tester is the idea that we can test all aspects. See, hey, does our function do what it's supposed to do? Does the knife cut? And we can do this in an automated fashion. Great functions are ones that serve a single purpose, and functions that serve a single purpose are easy to test. If we look here on the top right, you'll see an example of a tester test. So what is this test doing? Well, this get MX lookup function is running the MX command on the JumpCloud domain and storing it in this variable MX. Then we're looking at this variable and we're going to see, hey, does the command that was run, are the results that returned, is that part of the object, the result that is the command, MX? If the answer is yes, that means that this command ran successfully. And what we'll see here is we've got tests for all parts of this function, all of those different ways you can use it. So MX, A, DNS, all of these records and all of these API requests are done inside of this test to ensure that if we change something, we can test every aspect of it with a single command. When I think about the best way to build tests, I love to build tests that document all aspects of the module and then So for a 1.0, it'll have all tests for everything it can do. And then we think about upgrading from 1.0 to 1.1. What do we change? And let's test just for those changes. That way, we'll be able to see any sort of breaking changes that occur along the way, because if an update from 1.1 breaks a test from 1.0, it's very clear to us that that's some sort of breaking change that we might want to look at before we publish. So testing is so important. We should never make any assumption that it should just work because that's what the API documentation says. Often, like, you'll find that documentation is good, but documentation is not perfect. And what I found doing these tests was that the parameters were actually case sensitive. So HTTP and HTTPS parameters actually had to be with a capital H. So now that we've done our tests, we're at a point where we feel good about our code, and it's time to document it. And what Platypus does is it takes a module and it creates external help files in a markdown format, which we then have fields to fill in. That's so powerful because it takes the not fun part out of documentation, which is figuring out how you want to format it, how you want to get examples in. And it kind of lands on a best practice, which pulls off what Microsoft's done with their documentation for their commandments. So the way this works is I ran a Platypus command on my module file, and the output from this was 2 markdown files, which then were available for me to fill in the blanks. So it created the format in Markdown, and I just had to go in and fill in the blanks. And it's a really, really great tool that I highly recommend that's going to take your tool making to the next level, because it's going to allow you to document in a way that doesn't allow, that's not going to make users ask you how does this work if you do it right. So when it comes to Platypus, in addition to creating help that you can then plug in online, it also plugs in an XML help, which then gets packaged into your module, which creates PowerShell use its internal help system. So here you can see me using the built-in help to say help, and you'll see because I use I use Platypus, it's got the built-in help here based on these files that I've created. So those 3 Ps from a pretty high level are 100% my best practices for tool making, and you can use these with basic functions. You don't have to use these with advanced functions. So what's our final product? Once we are at a point where we've created our module, we have created our documentation, we've tested our module, it's now time to publish it. And it's so easy to publish to the PowerShell gallery. So here's an example of me publishing this module to the PowerShell gallery. And what we've got here is I published this MX lookup using my API key, which once you sign up for a Microsoft developer account, which is very easy, you get inside there. And now this module is available for everyone to download. So if you're on your machine and perhaps you have the terminal open, by running this command, install-module space MX lookup, and then with the scope current user parameter on there, you can have this tool on your machine to plug in an API key and check to see, have this in your tool belt for any issues that may come up, whether it's a blacklist issue, a DNS issue, an A record issue, or something I had to deal with a lot, which was an SPF issue, where you have to see who's verified senders on your domain. To sign up for an MXToolBox account, they offer, it's free. So if you just navigate to their website, MXToolBox, you'll see it's very easy to sign up for an account to get an API key. So here's my challenge. This was a ton of information and a very detailed process of how we can build tools. But if we think most basically, let's identify the tickets that are burying you and your team. What tickets are coming in, maybe once a day, twice a day, 5 a week, that just require, some sort of interaction with an app that provides a REST API? And how can you think about using that REST API to create perhaps a tool that still involves interaction, but perhaps from the command line, or perhaps through a scheduled job, where those tickets will continue to come in, but now you've got a repeatable and more efficient way to solve them. So once we've got that idea, we can build our way out. If we think about ways that we can really take automation into our environments, think about SaaS apps. Think about apps that require user accounts to be created. how can we incorporate that user account creation into some sort of onboarding workflow or offboarding workflow? Or maybe this isn't even about tickets. It's about providing a way to measure the performance of your team or measure the impact they're having. And in order for you to do that, perhaps you could create some sort of reporting using an API to get some details out. In addition to this, this isn't just about SaaS apps. Legacy applications. I maintained a wicked old dinosaur of a phone system, a Multitool phone system. And that phone system had this crazy way of how we had to create users. And that user creation process was prone to error. So I took it upon myself to use PowerShell to build an internal tool for us that took in information from a CSV and exported a CSV that I could then import into that legacy app. So this is not just about SaaS apps. And that final level is self-service. Of course, we don't want to give our users too much self-service because there are certain things that administrators should be responsible for. But perhaps we can give self-service to other departments by creating a tool in PowerShell. Maybe it's as simple as, creating a way for HR to send information over in a CSV file and then using that CSV file for an integration with another SaaS app or with an existing system. So here's an example of a challenge. So now that I'm at I made the change from working in corporate IT to join JumpCloud. And here we don't use Office 365, we use G Suite. As a former Office 365 admin, it's pretty easy to do group modifications in bulk. Using the command add distribution group member, pretty easy to do any sort of group modifications in bulk. Well, with G Suite, not so easy. To be completely clear, it is easy with some existing tools. G-Shell and GAM are examples of tools out there that you can use to interact with with the G Suite directory at scale. But I wanted to do this kind of using that idea of let's read G Suite's documentation for the API and see if we can figure this out. So step one, find and read the documentation. So G Suite and Google in general have so many APIs, and those APIs are incredibly well documented. So what I found is I found a link inside of their documentation to managing users and groups using the Google SDK or API. By dialing into this, I found exactly what I was looking for. I found the method I would need, a parameter, this concept of a group key, and also that endpoint, that URL that's specific to this API that I'll need for my tool. Also, I found, because now we're doing something where we're going to put information, in addition to the endpoint I need to figure out what request body I'm going to send. And down here, you'll see in the bottom, my API body, or here's an example. I'm adding a user's email address and I'm giving them the role of a member. So step two, what's my MVP or my minimum viable product? And this is an example that I took their documentation, I typed it out into a pretty simple PowerShell script, and that PowerShell script was my MVP. So this GIF that I've got running here basically shows the user addition happen. If we think about this in the top right, there's no sprinkles on this. This is the most basic thing that we would need to use the example of a donut to call this a donut. It is plain Jane, nothing special, nothing reusable. From here, we start to think about how do we want to customize this? And what I found is in order to do this at scale, I needed a couple different commands. So first, I needed the concept of after I add users, I kind of want to be able to see them. So I created another function using their API called get Google group member. And we went from that process of a script to a function, and I actually did not package this into a module because those GAM tools and that G-Shell are so well built, I don't want to confuse people and send them to the wrong tool, but I will show this tool in action. So up here on the right, we'll kind of see a couple items here that we have, and these are the parameters that we need. The group email address, and also the user email address to do this in bulk. So here we go. So now we're going to use this tool. So we're going to import users from a CSV. We've got my example CSV here in the bottom left. And once users are imported, then we're then going to use this command add Google group member to add them to the group email address, all users. So let's see how this bad boy works. So here we are. You'll see 0 members in the users, all groups. Here's an example of the CSV file with the column heading email address. And what we'll do here now is we're going to run these functions that I have here on the left. And by running this, we imported all these users and added them to the group. If we look, this object also shows us what state our users are in. But a quick refresh will show that now we've added from 0 to 20 users with a single click. So that's that challenge of being like, hey, I need to audit all of my Google groups. How the heck am I going to do that? And by building tools like this, you can do it through kind of that least common denominator, which is a CSV file. So that's kind of the idea of this, right? We want to think about the issues we're having and how we can automate them. It's my idea to show you guys how to pick those low-hanging fruits by reaching out to the tools that you're using and seeing what's available from an automation perspective. Go down that rabbit hole because it's going to not only advance your career, but for me, it makes me more excited and more engaged to do my job. The idea that you can be challenged with something. If you're interested in kind of seeing some of this code, here inside of this playground repository, inside of GitHub, you'll see that we've got all the stuff that we walked through documented. So if we want to look at the MX lookup module and see that code, here's that module. If you want to dive deeper in how I approach the Google Admin SDK, you can find the discovery here and the examples. In addition, I've provided some help for using this tool in the form of a kind of GIF-driven how-to. So if you're interested in your Google Apps admin, definitely reference this link if you kind of want to see how to connect to Google's API, because it is much more involved than just a simple API key. Outside of this, some other cool stuff that I'm working on that could be useful is yesterday I actually published the idea of a GitHub traffic tool, which simply returns information from the Insights tab of a GitHub wiki. If we think about why I did that, if you look at this traffic tab, all we get here for something like views is 10 days worth of information. So if you're in a position where perhaps you want to see what's popular and you have a GitHub that's posted that either end users or customers visit, this little tool would allow you to query this, output it to a file, and then be able to store more than 10 days of information. So that's something that I built that I'm actually using that you'll also find on this playground. Outside of that, if we think about how we can kind of get involved and learn more about PowerShell, I've also got some great resources here that help me kind of get up to speed. One of my favorite resources is this YouTube series, which is Learn Windows PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. And these are around 100 videos that might seem a little dated when you start to click into them, but do an incredible job of cutting the PowerShell language into small pieces that allow you to kind of learn one step at a time. So the videos are anywhere from 2 to 5 minutes long, and they're just really great kind of small tidbits of information that you can kind of take in at your own pace. After watching these videos, I really recommend watching some of these Getting Started with PowerShell videos, where the founder of PowerShell, Jeffrey Snover, who I had the pleasure to meet at Spice World this past year, does such an awesome job of introducing PowerShell and explaining why the language was built, why it was built, and how to use it. If you're more of a bookworm and want to read about this stuff, here are my favorite books as it comes to PowerShell. And then really the piece that I like to be involved in is the PowerShell Reddit community, where if you get stuck on something, this community is really incredible at allowing you to post your code and giving you feedback on, hey, this is a good idea, hey, that's where you're getting stuck. So I highly recommend that if you get in a situation where you're working on something and you feel like there's no one out there to help, check out this community because they're awesome. Outside of that, to stay up to date on how PowerShell is evolving, there's a great PowerShell open source community call that happens once a month, which gets posted to this YouTube channel that I have linked here. And that open source community kind of allows them to talk through how PowerShell core, which runs on Mac, Windows, and Linux, and is the language that I like to develop in, is kind of adapting and going to evolve over time. So that is kind of the run through, and we've got a couple minutes here at the end to answer some questions. So I'm gonna pop back over onto this last slide and pull up my questions tab and see what's going on here. Apologize for that echo we had at the beginning, guys. That definitely was a bummer, but thanks for hanging on there. So let's see what we got from a questions perspective. Okay, so here's an interesting question. So it says, when creating tools, do you place them in your PowerShell profile or call or load them when you need them? So that's a great question. the PowerShell profile is something that inside of PowerShell gets called every time you enter the terminal. And inside of this profile, we can, put functions, put ways to configure our environment, set API keys. For me, I turn my tools into functions, and then from functions into modules. And once you load a module, that module is always available every time you open the session. So that eliminates you from having to load those functions into your profile. So my answer to that would be, by creating modules and then loading those modules are always available. I use my PowerShell profile to set things like API keys so that I don't have to enter those and kind of store that information. And I also recently just started logging all of my PowerShell sessions and all the stuff that happens there out to a log file. So that's something also that you can do using your PowerShell profile. What are some example projects using PowerShell and API calls? So probably there's a ton of projects out there that use this. The one that I'm most familiar with is probably the one that I built, and that's actually the JumpCloud PowerShell module. So the JumpCloud PowerShell module is really the concept of taking those commandlets that we have for Active Directory and applying them to the JumpCloud directory. JumpCloud is, we offer directory services in a vendor-neutral environment. So instead of having an on-prem domain controller, you can leverage JumpCloud to manage users, systems, and then because the directory is in the cloud, access many of our protocols like LDAP, SSO, and Radius. So to kind of check that out, inside of my support GitHub, if we go down here into the playground, if you're new to PowerShell and kind of want to learn and use functions and don't have a domain controller to play with, JumpCloud can be a great sandbox environment for learning PowerShell, as you get up to 10 users free forever. So you can spin up an account, and then once you're in that account, really manage users the same way you would in Active Directory, but without the idea of having to have a physical domain controller or, bother a member of your team to say, hey, can I do this now? So that's something that's pretty cool. So outside of that, what other questions do we have here? It looks like a question about how I learned PowerShell. So really, I think I would say I learned PowerShell when I was kind of tasked with doing some administration inside Office 365. The example of, hey, we need to audit our distribution groups. And I was so tired of pointing and clicking in the console, I said, hey, there's got to be a better way. So that's kind of how I learned PowerShell, through necessity, as I just didn't have enough time to point and click to export all the stuff out. So after doing some Googling, I landed on what PowerShell was, and that kind of started my journey with PowerShell. So those are all the questions we have. Thanks everyone for attending. Again, I apologize for the echo that we experienced in the beginning. And you'll get a follow-up email from us with kind of information and links to this GitHub and to this repository if you want to check out this code. Again, the MXToolBox module is published on the PowerShell gallery, so feel free to install that and throw that into your tool belt. And I just want to thank Thomas from Expert Exchange for getting this set up. And thanks so much, guys. Enjoy March Madness. To give a score update, we've got Tennessee up 34-23 on Wright State at halftime. And it looks like Oklahoma and Rhode Island is a great game. Oklahoma up 3 with 10 minutes left. So have a great week, everyone, and thanks for joining.